As I've already talked about in a couple of other videos, I'm personally not big on doing theory videos and like to stick more to facts than speculation in regards to movies. Though if that is your cup of tea, you do you. I have no issue with that. But all that being said, that hasn't stopped me from doing a few theory videos in the past. And today, I'd like to talk about another theory that I've had for a while, which is that if greater forces were at work behind the sealing away of the Ark of the Covenant at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, then government indifference. So obviously this is going to be a slightly different video than the ones I usually do, being more speculative in nature. And if that's not really your sort of thing, please feel free to skip over this one. And there are also going to be even more spoilers for the first Indiana Jones movie, as well as a few other movies in the series ahead. So in case you don't want anything else ruined, you might want to be on the lookout. You have been warned. Okay, so as most of you probably already know, and as I just went over, Raiders of the Lost Ark ends with the United States government getting a hold of the Ark of the Covenant and then just sealing it away in a random warehouse because they couldn't be bothered to actually look into it despite Indy's warnings. But what if there was actually more to it than that? Because while the movie simply paints it as the government being uninterested in the Ark, beyond their enemies being unable to use it, it's possible something else could have been behind it as well. Specifically, what if God himself influenced those in charge to seal it away so that nobody would be able to analyze it or use it for horrible purposes? Now I know at first this might seem like an unlikely theory, since, among other things, the God that created the Ark of the Covenant is all about people having free will, and if he were to make government officials become uninterested in the Ark and seal it away, wouldn't that take away their free will? And that is a pretty strong argument, considering this is only a theory after all. But it could be possible that he didn't make them do what they did with the Ark, just subtly influenced them, and they chose to listen to that influence, thereby allowing him to get what he wanted while also not robbing those in charge of their free will. Besides, given how they behave in the movie, it's possible they didn't need much persuasion from God anyway. And what also backs this theory up is that there's clear evidence in the movie that God will act if he feels it's necessary, and in particular is shown to be very protective of his artifacts. And an obvious example of that would of course be him having the Angel of Death destroy those who look into the Ark of the Covenant at the end of the film. But a more subtle example is when the swastika emblem is burned off of the crate that the Ark is inside, showing that he not only has something against those who use that symbol, and not without reason, but he also refuses to have his Ark be branded with any symbol of theirs. So with this evidence, and especially because he allows Indy and Marion to survive because they followed his rules, it's extremely probable that he'd want the Ark sealed away once again so that people wouldn't abuse its powers, try to use it to their own twisted ends, or attempt to defile it like the Germans arguably had. And his protectiveness over his artifacts is only supported by what's shown in The Last Crusade, where he has the Holy Grail sealed in a private chamber that requires many life-threatening obstacles to get to, and even then is not permitted to leave the temple without the whole thing collapsing in on itself. So at least in the Indiana Jones series, as one has to keep in mind that none of this obviously applies to real life, it can be safely said that God does not want his artifacts to be known or used by the masses, to the point that he'd rather destroy the Holy Grail than have it be taken out of its sacred temple. And if he's willing to go to such lengths with the Holy Grail, then it seems logical that he would also subtly influence those in the government to seal the Ark away so that its true power would never be found out or used. Though another reason God could have been just as likely to want the Ark to become lost again is simply that he didn't want a repeat of what happened to the Germans, but on a much wider and more devastating scale. Because in that case, those were clearly people he himself had a vendetta against, as the burning of the swastika proves. So he probably had no problem killing them when they dared to open his precious Ark. But what about the next time somebody opened it? There could have been thousands of innocent people caught in the crossfire. And not to mention, what if it was being used by somebody with malicious intent? To put it simply, there are so many ways the Ark could have been used against God's wishes, and he probably knew that all too well, and thus would want those in charge to not be interested in its power, keep most from knowing it had even been found, and simply put it where nobody could use it. Because again, one has to admit that is better than many potential alternative scenarios where it ends up being used to commit mass murder and untold destruction. Now, as I said before, obviously all of this is simply speculation and can't be confirmed by anything shown in the movie directly beyond some potential context clues. And there's still also the question of whether or not God would even influence anybody to do what he wanted, even under the most dire of circumstances. Which, if it is possible, as I got into before, is still something that can't be supported by anything in the narrative. So really, in the end, it could have just been bureaucratic indifference that led to the Ark of the Covenant being sealed away, or God himself may have interfered and ensured that's what would happen so it wouldn't fall into the wrong hands and be abused. Though it doesn't really matter, since either way the conclusion remains the same. The Ark is left to collect dust in a warehouse, and Indy is left irritated that all his efforts were seemingly for nothing. But it is still interesting to think about, even if it ultimately doesn't change how the story ends. Though, depending on which interpretation you go by, it does affect whether one views that ending on a more triumphant or defeated note. Alright, I think I've made my point with all of this. So now I'd like to hear your opinions. Do you believe that God may have had a hand in the final fate of the Ark of the Covenant at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark? Or do you believe it was simply government indifference and that nothing larger was at work? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because you don't have to agree with anything I said in this video if you don't want to. You can feel about the ending of Raiders of the Lost Ark however you want to, and if you think my theory wasn't even close to being correct, that is absolutely fine. And thank you all for watching. I very greatly appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.